There is a question sitting at the center of modern science that the field has essentially decided not to answer. Not shelved for lack of funding. Not deferred because the tools aren't ready. Decided against. Because the question points somewhere that the standard framework of science is not built to go. And the question is this: why does anything feel like something? You are conscious right now. You are having an experience. Light is hitting your eyes. Sound is reaching your ears. Your brain is processing language and building meaning from it. All of that is measurable. All of that is physical. And yet there is something it is like to be you doing this right now. That felt quality, that inner presence, that private first-person experience of existing is precisely what every physical law we have gives us no mechanism to explain. This is not a philosophical curiosity. It is a genuine scientific crisis. The most credentialed neuroscientists, philosophers of mind and physicists working on this problem have spent decades staring at it, and the question has not moved. Here is what makes it a crisis rather than just an open problem. Science solves open problems. It always has. We did not know how stars burned a century ago. We know now. We did not understand the structure of DNA. We do now. When science encounters a question it cannot currently answer, the normal response is more data, better instruments, refined models. That process works. The hard problem of consciousness is different. More data has not helped. Better instruments have not helped. We have more information about the brain than at any point in history, and the core question is in exactly the same place it was in 1995 when philosopher David Chalmers formally named it. That should stop you. It does not stop most people. Because most people assume the answer is coming, and the delay is temporary. Here is my position on that assumption. It is not supported by the evidence. To understand why, you need to separate two things that get treated as the same thing. There are what Chalmers called the easy problems of consciousness, and there is the hard problem. The easy problems are not actually easy. They represent decades of serious neuroscientific work. How does the brain integrate information from different sensory systems into a unified experience? How does it discriminate between stimuli? How does it regulate attention? How does it control behavior? These are tractable questions. We have made real progress on all of them. We have mapped neural correlates, identified the brain regions involved in awareness, and developed computational models that explain how information moves through neural architecture. That progress is real, and it matters. But it is progress on a different question than the one that counts. The hard problem asks something else entirely. It asks why any of this processing is accompanied by experience at all. You can describe every neuron firing in the visual cortex when a person sees red. You can map the electrical cascade, measure the chemical signals, trace the propagation pathway from retina to cortex to frontal lobe. And when you are finished, you have explained exactly how the brain processes the wavelength. You have explained nothing about why that processing feels like red, why it has that particular quality, why it feels like anything rather than nothing. That gap between the complete physical description and the felt experience is the hard problem, and it is not a gap that more neuroscience closes. It is a structural problem with a different shape than the questions neuroscience is designed to answer. Think about what it would mean to have a perfect map of the brain. Every synapse, every firing rate, every chemical concentration, every electrical signal accounted for. A complete God-level physical description of every process occurring in a conscious mind. Would that map tell you what it feels like to be that person? Would it explain why the pain hurts, why the red looks red, why there is an inside to the experience at all? The answer, and here is where the field quietly divides, appears to be no. Physical descriptions are third-person descriptions. Consciousness is a first-person phenomenon, and no accumulation of third-person facts has ever produced a first-person explanation. This is not mysticism. It is a precise technical problem that has been formally published, rigorously argued, and left without a satisfying answer by the sharpest minds in the relevant fields. Something about our basic framework for understanding reality may be wrong. That is what the evidence points at, not because we lack the data, but because the data we have does not speak to the thing we are actually trying to explain. Every few years, a neuroscience lab publishes a finding that the press covers as a breakthrough on consciousness. And every few years, that finding explains something real and leaves the central question exactly where it was. Here is what the breakthroughs actually show. The brain takes in raw sensory data and integrates it. Sound from one region, visual input from another, spatial information from a third. These signals converge. They get combined into a single, coherent representation of what is happening right now. We can watch this happen. We can identify the regions involved. We can disrupt specific pathways and predict exactly which part of the integrated picture falls apart. That is not speculation. That is documented, repeatable, published across thousands of studies. The mechanisms are real. The maps are real. The global workspace theory is one of the clearest examples of genuine progress. The core idea is that the brain contains a kind of central broadcasting system. Information processed locally in specialized regions gets selected, amplified, and transmitted widely across the brain, becoming available to multiple cognitive systems at once. When that broadcast happens, the information enters what researchers call the global workspace. That is what awareness looks like from the outside. You can measure when a stimulus crosses the threshold into the global workspace. You can track the neural signature of that broadcast in real time. Specific prefrontal and parietal regions light up. The timing is consistent. The pattern is reliable. What does that tell you? It tells you exactly how information becomes globally available in a brain. That is real. That matters. The neural correlates of consciousness follow the same pattern. Researchers identify specific clusters of neural activity that accompany specific conscious experiences. See a face, a particular region activates. Attend to motion, a different region engages. Lose consciousness under anesthesia, and certain connectivity patterns collapse in a measurable, predictable way. These are not rough approximations. They are precise. Some of them have direct clinical applications. We can now assess levels of consciousness in unresponsive patients using techniques that measure how widely the brain can integrate information. People who were written off as vegetative have been identified as aware. That is what good science looks like. Functional, predictive, useful. So here is the question the press release never asks. After all of that, after the correlates and the workspace and the mapped regions and the clinical tools, what have we actually explained about consciousness itself? We have explained which processes correlate with it. We have explained how information moves through the brain when it is happening. We have not explained why any of it produces experience. We have not explained what experience is or why it exists at all. That gap has not narrowed. Not one measurement has brought us closer to it. Consider what a complete map would look like. Imagine every neuron, every synapse, every firing rate, every chemical gradient in a living conscious brain, captured in total detail at a single moment. Every ion channel, every neurotransmitter concentration, every electrical potential across every membrane. You have the complete picture. Now answer the question. Why does it feel like something to be that brain? Why is there an inside to it? Why is the processing not just happening in the dark, without any felt quality, the way a thermostat processes temperature without experiencing warmth? The complete map does not answer this. It does not even point toward an answer. That is what makes this different from every other hard problem science has faced. This is where qualia become the precise statement of the problem. Not a vague philosophical concept, a technical term with a specific meaning. Qualia are the felt qualities of experience. The redness of red. Not the wavelength, not the neural response to that wavelength, not the behavioral output produced by seeing red. The actual felt character of seeing it. The painfulness of pain. Not the nociceptive signal, not the avoidance reflex, not the emotional distress response, the actual felt quality of it hurting. Every functional explanation in neuroscience accounts for the mechanism and leaves the felt quality completely untouched. Describe the full processing chain for pain in exhaustive detail, and you have described everything except the part that makes pain pain. That remainder, that residual felt quality, is precisely what the easy problems leave behind. Why is that not the headline every time a new neural correlate gets published? A new correlate tells you that when consciousness is present, this region is active. It does not tell you why activity in that region produces experience rather than nothing. The correlation is real, the explanation is missing, and the field mostly treats the correlation as the achievement and leaves the explanation for later. Later has not arrived. It has been decades. The correlates keep accumulating. The explanation keeps not appearing. That is worth sitting with. The easy problems are genuinely hard in the ordinary scientific sense. Solving them takes resources, precision, and decades of effort. The progress is real, and it matters. But every step forward on the easy problems clarifies exactly what they are not solving. The more precisely we map how information moves through a conscious brain, the more clearly we can see the question sitting just outside that map. Why is any of this accompanied by experience at all? That question does not get smaller as the neuroscience gets better. The better we get at the easy problems, the sharper the outline of the hard one becomes.
Science explains things by reducing them, by showing that one phenomenon is actually another phenomenon understood at a finer level of detail. That method has worked extraordinarily well. It is the engine behind almost every major scientific advance of the last 3 centuries. And it is precisely where the problem with consciousness begins. Take liquidity. We did not always know what made water flow, or why it pooled at the bottom of a container, instead of holding its shape. Then we understood molecules, and the question dissolved. Liquidity is just what happens when molecular forces allow particles to slide past each other, rather than hold fixed positions. One phenomenon, explained by reducing it to another. The explanation feels complete, because it is complete. There is nothing left over, nothing that the molecular account fails to capture. The same logic applies to heat. Before we understood thermodynamics, heat was a mysterious substance called caloric, that supposedly flowed from hot objects to cold ones. Then we understood that heat is molecular kinetic energy, and the mystery evaporated. Again, complete, nothing left anew, explained. Now, try to apply the same method to consciousness. You want to explain why seeing the color red feels like something. So you go deeper. You describe the wavelength of the incoming light. You trace the signal from the retina through the optic nerve into the visual cortex. You map the neural firing patterns that correspond to the perception of red. You describe the chemical gradients, the ion channels, the electrochemical cascades propagating through layers of cortical tissue. You do all of this with perfect precision. And when you finish, the question is still sitting there, untouched. Why does any of that feel like red? Why does it feel like anything at all? The molecular account of liquidity left nothing over. The neural account of color perception leaves the most important thing complete: lie, unaddressed. This is what philosopher Joseph Levine formally named the explanatory gap in 1983. His point was precise, and it has not been answered. Even if we knew every physical fact about what happens in the brain when someone sees red, we would still face a question that the physical account cannot close. There is a gap between the objective description of neural processes and the subjective experience those processes are supposed to explain. Levine's argument was not that the brain does not produce consciousness. It was that even if it does, we have no account of how or why, and the standard tools of scientific reduction do not provide one. Because those tools move from one objective description to another. They do not cross into the first person. Here is the distinction that matters. A third-person description is a description of something from the outside. Neural firing rates, chemical concentrations, electrical propagation patterns, all of these are third-person facts. They are measurable, shareable, objective. A first-person fact is different in kind. What it is like to taste coffee, to feel a muscle cramp, to hear a note resolve. These are not facts you read off an instrument. They are facts you have from the inside. The history of science has been spectacularly good at third-person facts. It has no established method for first-person facts. And consciousness, by definition, is a first-person phenomenon. Thomas Nagel made this concrete in 1974 with a paper that remains one of the most cited in the philosophy of mind. Imagine a bat. Bats navigate using echolocation. They emit high-frequency sound pulses and build a spatial picture of their environment from the returning echoes. You can know every physical fact about this system. You can know the frequency of the pulses, the neural architecture that processes the returning signals, the behavioral outputs the system produces. You can know all of it, and you will still not know what it is like to be a bat navigating by sound. The what it is likeness is exactly what the physical description does not reach. Not because the description is incomplete, because the description is the wrong type of thing entirely. Physical facts and experiential facts are not on the same scale. You cannot accumulate enough of one to arrive at the other. What does that tell you about the standard reductive strategy? It tells you the strategy has a hard boundary. That boundary is not a temporary obstacle that better instruments or more data will remove. It is structural. Levine's formulation of the explanatory gap is not a complaint that neuroscience has not worked hard enough. It is a claim about the conceptual relationship between physical descriptions and subjective experience. They are descriptions of fundamentally different kinds of things, and reducing one to the other requires a bridge that nobody has built, or even convincingly sketched. There is a response to this that comes up frequently. The response says, "We once could not explain how life could arise from non-living chemistry, and now we can."
We once could not explain how hereditary information could be stored and transmitted, and then we found DNA. The argument is that consciousness is just the next hard problem in a long sequence of hard problems that science eventually solved. That position is worth taking seriously. But notice the difference. Explaining life from chemistry is explaining one objective phenomenon from another. Explaining heredity from molecular structure is explaining one objective phenomenon from another. No first-person fact was ever at stake in either of those transitions. Consciousness is not that kind of problem. It is not a complex mechanism pairing to be decomposed. It is a felt quality waiting to be accounted for, and felt qualities are not mechanisms. This is not mysticism. It is not a claim that consciousness is supernatural, or that the brain is not involved. It is a technically precise, formally published problem that has sat in the philosophical and scientific literature for decades without a satisfying answer, and the absence of that answer is not for lack of trying. In 1995, a philosopher named David Chalmers published a thought experiment that a significant portion of the professional philosophy community has still not recovered from. The setup is simple. Imagine a being that is physically identical to you in every measurable way. Same atoms, same neural architecture, same brain chemistry, same behavioral outputs. When this being touches a hot stove, its hand retracts. Its vocal system produces the word, ouch. Ask it whether it feels pain and it will tell you yes. Ask it to describe the sensation and it will produce a coherent, detailed account. It passes every behavioral test for consciousness that you can design. The only difference is this: there is nothing it is like to be that being. No felt quality to any of it. No inner experience. No light on inside. The word ouch is produced, but nothing hurts. The color red is reported, but nothing is seen. Every output is present. The experience is absent. That is the phil. A sophical zombie. Here is the argument Chalmers built from it. If a philosophical zombie is conceivable, if we can coherently imagine such a being without contradiction, then consciousness is not logically entailed by any physical fact. Because if consciousness were purely physical, two beings with identical physical properties could not differ in consciousness. Physical identity would guarantee experiential identity. The zombie breaks that guarantee. The zombie has every physical property you have, and it has no experience, which means experience must be something additional, something the physical facts do not capture. This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a formal logical argument, and it has the structure of a proof. If zombies are conceivable, physicalism is false. That is the conclusion. Physical-ism, the view that everything that exists is physical, cannot survive the zombie. What does that tell you about how seriously the philosophy community took this? The paper generated responses from virtually every major figure in philosophy of mind. 30 years later, those responses are still being written. The debate is not closed. That is not because philosophers are slow. It is because the argument is genuinely hard to answer. The first line of objection is the most obvious one. Maybe zombies are not actually conceivable, and we are fooling ourselves. Conceivability is a cognitive act, and our cognitive capacities are limited. We cannot always trust our intuitions about what is logically possible. Consider water. Before chemistry, you could easily imagine a substance that looked, tasted, and behaved exactly like water, but had a completely different molecular structure. That imagination felt coherent. It was not, because water is H2O by necessity. Once you know the chemistry, the seeming conceivability of NONH2O water dissolves. Some physicalists argue the same thing is happening with zombies. Our intuition that they are conceivable reflects our ignorance about how consciousness relates to physical processes. If we understood the relationship fully, the zombie would seem as incoherent as NONH2O water. The problem with this objection is that it requires us to believe that consciousness reduces to physical processes in the same way water reduces to molecular structure. That is precisely the thing in dispute. The objection assumes what it needs to prove. The second objection is more radical. Daniel Dennett argues that Chalmers has the situation exactly backwards. There is no inner experience over and above the functional outputs. What we call consciousness, the felt quality, the inner light, is itself a kind of cognitive illusion, a story the brain tells about its own processes. When you report that pain hurts, you are not reporting a genuine qualitative experience that exists separately from the neural processing. You are reporting the neural processing itself, dressed up in the language of experience. On this view, there are no qualia to explain. The hard problem dissolves, because the thing it was trying to explain was never real to begin with. We are all philosophical zombies. We just think we are not, because our brains generate that. representation of themselves. Here is my position on that. Dennett's argument requires you to accept that your most immediate and direct experience, the thing you are more certain of than anything else you could possibly know, is an illusion, not a misinterpretation of something real, an illusion. The redness of red is not real. The painfulness of pain is not real. These reports are generated by a system that has no inner life and no experience of anything. That conclusion may be technically coherent, but it has a significant cost. It asks you to distrust first-person evidence about subjective experience while trusting third-person evidence about physical processes. It is not obvious why the second kind of evidence should be privileged over the first kind when the question is specifically about subjective experience. That is worth sitting with. Neither side can definitively close the argument. The pro-zombie camp cannot prove zombies are genuinely possible, only that they appear conceivable. The anti-zombie camp cannot prove they are incoherent, only that conceivability might mislead us. Dennett cannot prove consciousness is an illusion. Chalmers cannot prove it is not physical. What we have is a formally structured disagreement between serious researchers with incompatible intuitions about the most basic question you could ask about minds. And what that means is that 30 years after the zombie argument was published, the honest answer to the question it raises, is consciousness purely physical, remains open. Genuinely, technically, uncomfortably open. Which means the argument that was supposed to settle the question has mostly succeeded in making the question more uncomfortable. The first response to the hard problem from biologists is almost always the same. Consciousness evolved because it was useful. And at first pass, that answer is compelling. Evolution is ruthless about waste. Features that cost metabolic resources and confer no advantage get pruned across generations. The brain is the most metabolically expensive organ in the human body. It runs on roughly 20% of your caloric intake, while accounting for roughly 2% of your body weight. Something that costly persists only because it earns its keep. So the argument goes, consciousness must be earning its keep. And there is real evidence for this. An organism that can consciously deliberate, that can hold multiple options in mind, compare outcomes, and make flexible decisions, can respond to novel situations in real time. It does not need to wait for natural selection to slowly encode the right behavior into its genome across thousands of generations. It figures it out now. That is a massive adaptive advantage. The behavioral repertoire expands. Learning within a single lifetime becomes possible. Social coordination of extraordinary complexity becomes possible. Look at what human consciousness built. Language, agriculture, cities, medicine. None of that is available to a system running purely on fixed instinctual response. The functional case for consciousness is not trivial. Here is where it breaks down. Every single one of those advantages, the flexible response, the real-time learning, the behavioral adaptability, the social coordination, could in principle be accomplished by a sufficiently complex information processing system with no inner experience whatsoever. Read that carefully. A system with no inner experience. A system in which there is nothing it is like to be that system. Such a system could discriminate between stimuli, integrate sensory signals, generate context-sensitive responses, accumulate learned patterns across a lifetime, coordinate behavior with other similar systems. It would do everything a conscious organism does. It would just be dark inside. No felt quality to any of it. The evolutionary argument explains why complex processing would be selected for. It does not explain why that processing had to feel like something. Those are two completely different claims, and the biology literature frequently treats them as the same claim. That is the mistake worth sitting with. The clearest way to see this is through pain. Pain is one of the most ancient and widespread phenomena in the animal kingdom. The functional story is clean. Tissue damage triggers a signal. That signal generates avoidance behavior. The organism withdraws from the harmful stimulus and survives to reproduce. Selection pressure strongly favors organisms that respond to damage. That much is unambiguous. But now ask the next question. Why does it have to hurt? Why does the signal have to carry felt suffering with it? An unconscious damage detection system that triggered avoidance behavior without any accompanying experience would accomplish exactly the same functional work. The organism would still withdraw. The organism would still survive. The behavior would be identical. What the unconscious version would not have is the felt quality of pain. The thing that makes pain distinctively awful. The thing that makes you recoil from the memory of it. The thing that makes pain clinically significant as an experience rather than just a mechanism. What additional function does that felt quality perform that the unconscious signal does not already perform? This is not a rhetorical question, it is a genuine technical question, and the evolutionary framework does not have a clean answer to it. Some researchers have proposed that the felt quality is doing additional functional work after all. The argument is that conscious experience allows for more flexible, context-sensitive responses than any unconscious system could manage. That the felt quality of pain, specifically, is what allows an organism to weigh the cost of injury against the benefit of continuing a behavior, in a way that pure reflex cannot. A soldier under extreme circumstances can override acute pain to complete a critical task. The felt quality, on this view, is precisely what allows that kind of executive modulation. That is a serious argument. It deserves acknowledgement. But notice what it is actually arguing. It is arguing that felt experience produces different functional outputs than unfelt processing would. It is arguing that consciousness is doing causal work in the world. And if that is true, then you are back at the interaction problem that haunts dualism. How exactly does a subjective feeling reach into the physical causal chain and change what a neuron does? Answering the evolutionary objection by saying consciousness is causally efficacious creates a new problem that may be harder than the original one. There is another layer here that the standard evolutionary account quietly skips. Consciousness as we experience it is not just flexible processing, it is not just adaptive responsiveness. It includes the appreciation of beauty, the anguish of grief, the specific quality of hearing music, the sense of what it is like to exist in time and have a past and anticipate a future. What is the survival advantage of any of that? Why does seeing a particular arrangement of colors produce something that feels like wonder? The functional explanation stretches thinner and thinner as you move from basic pain response toward the richer textures of conscious experience. Evolution selects for behavior. It selects for outputs. The inner dimension, the felt character of what it is to be a living thing navigating the world, is precisely what the selection pressure has no direct grip on. And that is the problem. Not that the biology is wrong, but that the biology is describing something different from what consciousness actually is. The brain that evolution built is extraordinary. The processing it performs is extraordinary. That the hard problem is not about the processing. It is about the experience of the processing. Natural selection does not select for feelings. It selects for functions. And those two things are not the same. The field has not been idle. There are serious theories, developed by serious researchers, with mathematical frameworks and empirical predictions and clinical applications. This is worth saying clearly before going further. The absence of a solution is not the absence of effort. Some of the most rigorous thinking in modern science has been directed at this problem. What we have are serious proposals. What we do not have is an answer. And the difference between those two things is exactly what this section is about. Start with functionalism. It is the dominant position among philosophers of mind and cognitive scientists. A 2020 survey of professional philosophers found that roughly a third of respondents accepted or leaned toward functionalism, making it the single most popular response to the mind-body problem in the field. The core claim is straightforward. Mental states are defined by what they do, not by what they are made of. A pain is not a specific pattern of neural firing. A pain is whatever state gets caused by tissue damage, drives avoidance behavior, captures attention, and shapes memory. The physical substrate is incidental. What matters is the functional role. This is intellectually appealing. It explains why mental states could in principle be realized by different physical systems. It makes consciousness tractable for science. If consciousness is just what happens when a system performs certain functions, then neuroscience and computer science together can close in on it. Here is the problem with that. In the 1970s, philosopher Ned Block proposed what became known as the China brain thought experiment. Imagine the entire population of China organized to replicate the functional structure of a human brain. Each person stands in for a neuron. They communicate with each other by radio, according to the same rules that govern synaptic signaling. The system as a whole takes inputs and produces outputs in exactly the way a functioning brain does. Functionalism, applied consistently, says this system would be conscious. It performs the functions. It plays the causal roles. Most people's intuition rejects this immediately. A billion people standing in fields with radios does not feel like a candidate for inner experience. Bloch's point was that the intuition is a signal. If functionalism implies that the China brain is conscious, something may be wrong with functionalism's core assumption. The felt quality of experience seems to require more than function. What more, exactly, is the thing nobody can specify? Integrated information theory takes a different approach. It was developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi and has been refined over 2 decades into a rigorous mathematical framework. The central claim is that consciousness is identical to integrated information, not correlated with it, identical to it. Tononi defined a mathematical quantity he called phi, which measures how much information a system generates as a whole above and beyond the information generated by its parts. A system with high phi is highly conscious. A system with low phi is minimally conscious or not conscious at all. This has real advantages. It makes specific testable predictions. It has been used clinically. A tool called the Perturbational Complexity Index, derived from IIT, is now used in hospitals to assess levels of consciousness in patients with disorders of awareness. That is not a footnote. That is a theory doing actual scientific work. But IIT carries a consequence that makes many researchers uncomfortable. If consciousness is identical to integrated information, and if integrated information is present in varying degrees across many physical systems, then consciousness in some form exists almost everywhere. Not richly, not in any way resembling human experience, but in some minimal form. Even simple systems with modest integration would have a sliver of experience. That is panpsychism. It follows directly from the theory's logic. Neuroscientist Anil Seth, who has engaged seriously with IIT, has specifically objected to this. The claim that integrated information actually is consciousness, not merely correlates with it, is the part of the theory he finds hardest to accept. Whether IIT's panpsychist implication is a reductio ad absurdum or a genuine insight about the nature of reality is an open question. What it is not is a solved one. Global workspace theory offers something different. It was developed by cognitive scientist Bernard Baars and has been elaborated significantly since. The core idea is that consciousness is what happens when information gets broadcast into a global workspace, a kind of central broadcasting system in the brain that makes information widely available to multiple cognitive processes simultaneously. When you become aware of something, on this view, it is because that information has been selected and broadcast across the brain into this shared space, where it can influence attention, memory, planning, and behavior all at once. This explains a great deal. It maps onto brain imaging data. It predicts which stimuli will reach awareness and which will not. It explains why attention is limited and why some information stays unconscious. Global workspace theory is a serious, empirically supported account of how consciousness functions in the brain. What it does not do is touch the hard problem. It explains which information gets globally broadcast. It does not explain why broadcasting information feels like anything. You could run a global workspace system in the dark, processing information, selecting stimuli, routing signals through a central hub, generating appropriate outputs, with no inner experience attached to any of it. The theory is silent on why that scenario is different from the one that includes felt experience. And that silence is not an oversight. It is the hard problem, still sitting there, after the theory has done everything it can do. Here is my position on where this leaves us. These are not bad theories. They are not the work of people who fail to think carefully. Functionalism captures something true about the relationship between mind and physical substrate. IIT captures something true about the importance of integration and information structure. Global workspace theory captures something true about how attention and awareness operate in the brain. What none of them capture is why the processing they describe is accompanied by the felt quality of experience. They explain the mechanism. They do not explain the light that seems to be on inside the mechanism. That gap is not a detail they missed. It is the question they were built to answer. Each of them explains something real, and none of them explains the thing hat matters most. The theory that the professional philosophy community is most uncomfortable with is probably also the one that deserves the most serious attention. Panpsychism holds that consciousness is not something the physical world produces under certain conditions. It holds that consciousness is a fundamental feature of physical reality, present at every level, including in elementary particles. Not that electrons experience joy, or that a hydrogen atom deliberates. That is not the claim. The claim is more precise and more unsettling than that. Some minimal form of experiential property is constitutive of matter itself, not a rich inner life, a proto-conscious property, something like the seed of experience, woven into the fabric of what exists. This is the position. And before dismissing it, consider what drove serious philosophers toward it in the first place. Every alternative theory has a specific failure point. Physicalism cannot close the explanatory gap. We have covered this in detail. You can describe every neuron, every chemical gradient, every oscillating neural circuit, and you remain on the wrong side of an unbridgeable divide. Third-person descriptions do not add up to first-person facts. That gap is not a temporary embarrassment waiting for better imaging technology. It is structural. Dualism solves that particular problem by declaring mind and matter two distinct kinds of thing, But then it faces the interaction problem. If the mind is genuinely non-physical, how does it cause anything to happen in a physical brain? How does a decision, located in no place and made of no matter, produce a cascade of neurons firing? Nobody has given a satisfying answer to that in 350 years. Functionalism says mental states are defined by their functional role, which sounds clean until you run the China brain argument. If function is all that matters, 1 billion people connected by radio and organized to mimic neural firing patterns would constitute a conscious mind. Most people's intuition rejects this immediately. And eliminativism, the position that consciousness as we conceive it simply does not exist, requires something even stranger. It requires you to conclude that your own experience, the one happening right now, is a kind of illusion. Which raises the obvious question: an illusion for whom? Here is my position on what this catalogue of failures actually tells you. It tells you that the options are not ranked by plausibility. They are ranked by which impossibility you are most willing to accept. And panpsychism's impossibility, the one that makes people uncomfortable, is that rocks and electrons and photons might have something in common with your experience of reading this sentence. Against that discomfort, weigh what the other positions ask you to accept. Physicalism asks you to accept a miracle with no mechanism. Dualism asks you to accept causation without contact. Eliminativism asks you to accept that the most certain thing you know is not real. Why is panpsychism the one that gets dismissed at the level of intuition while the others are taken seriously? That asymmetry is worth examining. The structural advantage of panpsychism is precise. It does not require consciousness to emerge from non-consciousness. Every other physicalist theory faces what you could call the emergence problem. At some point in the development of a brain, or a nervous system, or a fetus, something went from having zero experience to having experience. When did that happen? What physical threshold was crossed? What configuration of matter, once achieved, suddenly flipped on the inner light? Nobody knows. Nobody has even proposed a candidate mechanism that the field finds satisfying. Panpsychism dissolves this problem, not by solving it, but by eliminating the step that makes it impossible. If experiential properties are present at the lowest level of physical reality, then the development of complex consciousness is not an emergence of something from nothing. It is a combination and organization of something that was already there. The hard problem does not disappear, but it transforms into a different kind of question. That different question is called the combination problem, and it is genuinely hard. Here is what it asks. If electrons and quarks have proto-conscious properties, how do billions of them combine to produce the unified, integrated experience you actually have? Your experience is not a collection of billions of separate micro-experiences. It is one experience, unified, coherent, happening from a single point of view. How does that unity arise from a mass of particles each carrying their own minimal experiential property? This is panpsychism's own internal explanatory gap. The combination problem does not dissolve. It sits in the center of the theory and resists the same kind of clean solution that the hard problem resists everywhere else. Proponents of panpsychism acknowledge this. The theory does not come with a free pass on the difficult questions. What it comes with is a different placement of the difficulty, one that some philosophers find more tractable than the standard explanatory gap. Philosopher Philip Goff, one of the most rigorous contemporary defenders of panpsychism, argues that the combination problem, while serious, is a problem about how experiential properties combine, which is at least a problem within a framework that takes experience seriously as a real feature of the world. The hard problem, on standard physicalism, is a problem about how experience arises from something that contains no experience at all. That is a categorically different kind of problem. Goff's argument is not that panpsychism is easy. It is that the alternatives are harder in ways the field has been slow to fully reckon with. What does that tell you about where this discussion actually is? Panpsychism is not a fringe view. It is held by serious philosophers at serious institutions, published in serious journals, engaged with by neuroscientists who have found that their empirical frameworks keep generating questions their frameworks cannot answer. The discomfort around it is sociological as much as it is philosophical. It sounds strange. It sounds like mysticism dressed in academic language. But the strangeness of a position is not an argument against it. Every serious alternative to panpsychism requires explaining how something arises from something it has nothing in common with, and nobody has done that. The hard problem has been formally named, rigorously debated, mathematically modeled, and signed onto by some of the most credentialed researchers in neuroscience and philosophy. And yet if you look at where the money goes, where the careers are built, where the journals publish their most celebrated findings, the hard problem is barely there. Not because the field decided it was wrong, because the field decided it was inconvenient. Here is what the structure of science actually rewards. A neuroscientist who maps the neural correlates of visual awareness can publish in top journals, attract grant funding, build a laboratory, train graduate students, and spend a career advancing a measurable research program. A neuroscientist who asks whether those neural correlates explain subjective experience or merely accompany it is asking a question that no existing methodology can answer cleanly. That distinction between correlation and explanation is the entire heart of the hard problem. Funding bodies do not respond well to questions that cannot be operationalized. So the question gets quietly set aside, not rejected, just underfunded, understaffed, and structurally discouraged. This is not conspiracy. It is something simpler and more systemic. Science is built around tractable questions. The peer review process, the grant application process, the publication process. All of it is designed to evaluate whether a research program can produce verifiable, reproducible results. Consciousness research, at the level of the hard problem, cannot easily do that. You cannot run a double-blind trial on subjective experience. You cannot falsify a theory of qualia the way you can falsify a theory of protein folding. The institutional machinery of science is optimized for a kind of question that the hard problem is not. What makes this worth sitting with is the pattern. In 1995, David Chalmers formally named the hard problem in a paper that became one of the most cited in philosophy of mind. The field acknowledged it. Conferences were held. Responses were published. Then the field returned to neural correlates. In 2004, Giulio Tononi published Integrated Information Theory with a rigorous mathematical framework, a measurable quantity, and testable predictions. The field engaged with it seriously. Clinical applications emerged, and the core question, why integrated information would be accompanied by experience, remained exactly as open as it was before the theory existed. Then came 2023. Dozens of leading consciousness researchers, including major figures from both the IIT camp and the global Workspace theory camp, signed an open letter acknowledging that after decades of active research and direct competition between these two dominant frameworks, neither had been validated. Neither had produced the kind of decisive empirical result that would move the field toward consensus. The letter was not a retraction, it was an honest accounting. And what happened after it was published? Coverage in science media, discussion at conferences, and then the field moved on. That pattern is the same pattern every time. A credentialed researcher formally publishes something that should generate sustained institutional engagement. The field acknowledges it briefly, and then continues doing what it was already doing. Why? Part of the answer is professional risk. The asymmetry is the same here as in any field where the big question is also the dangerous question. Ask the hard problem seriously, build a career around it, and get it wrong, or get it nowhere, and the professional cost is real. Stay inside the tractable questions, produce clean empirical results, and nothing bad happens to you personally. The incentive structure does not point toward the hardest question, it points toward the answerable one. But there is something deeper here than individual career calculation. Consciousness research sits at the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy, physics, and cognitive science, and none of those fields fully owns it. Neuroscientists can study the brain correlates but are trained to be skeptical of philosophical claims about qualia. Philosophers can sharpen the arguments but have no laboratory. Physicists can model information and quantum dynamics but typically regard consciousness as someone else's problem. Cognitive scientists can build functional models, but the hard problem sits below the level their models address. The question falls into the gaps between institutions. No single department has the mandate to pursue it fully, and no funding agency has the charter to treat it as a primary target. What does that tell you? Here is my position on it. When a question is this important and this neglected simultaneously, the neglect is itself a data point. The hard problem is not obscure, it is not fringe. It has been formally published, rigorously argued, mathematically developed and publicly acknowledged as unresolved by the leading researchers in the field. The gap between how serious the problem is and how seriously the institutions pursue it is not explained by the problem being unimportant. It is explained by the problem being unanswerable, by the tools the institutions are built to use. That is a structural failure, not a moral one, not a deliberate one, a structural one. The machinery is not designed for this class of problem, and the machinery keeps running. In 1995, the problem was named. In 2004, a mathematical theory addressed part of it. In 2023, the leading researchers signed a letter admitting neither dominant theory had delivered. Each of those moments marked the problem as serious. None of them reorganized how the field allocates resources, trains researchers, or defines what counts as progress. And the field has spent 3 decades doing exactly what institutions do with questions that are too big to answer comfortably. Acknowledging them carefully, and funding something smaller instead. Roger Penrose is one of the most decorated mathematical physicists alive, the man who proved fundamental theorems about black holes alongside Stephen Hawking, and his theory of consciousness is considered by most of the field to be wrong. That matters. Not because being unpopular makes a theory correct, it does not. But Penrose is not a crank, he is not a science journalist speculating beyond his credentials. He is one of the most rigorous mathematical minds of the 20th century, and he looked at the hard problem of consciousness and concluded that standard physics cannot get there. That conclusion is worth taking seriously before we dismiss where it led him. His starting point was not neuroscience, it was mathematics. Specifically, it was Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems, published in 1931. What Gödel proved is this: any formal mathematical system powerful enough to describe basic arithmetic contains true statements that the system itself cannot prove. The system cannot fully account for its own truths. Penrose's argument built from there. Human mathematicians, he observed, can recognize certain mathematical truths that no algorithm could derive. We can see what a formal system cannot see about itself. If human cognition were purely algorithmic, purely computational, this should be impossible. The fact that it appears to happen implies something. It implies that human thought is not reducible to classical computation. And if it is not classical computation, something else is happening inside the brain, something that operates outside the rules of deterministic information processing. Penrose looked at physics for a candidate process and found one in quantum mechanics. The specific proposal, developed with anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, is called orchestrated objective reduction, or Orch-OR. The core claim is that quantum mechanical processes occur inside structures called microtubules, which are protein scaffolding found inside neurons. These processes are not random. They are orchestrated by biological factors and collapse in ways that are neither purely deterministic nor purely random, occupying a space between the two that classical physics cannot describe. Hameroff came to the theory from a different direction. He had spent years studying how anesthetics work, and he noticed that general anesthesia suppresses consciousness without shutting down the brain's basic computational functions. Neurons keep firing, information keeps processing, the lights go out anyway. His conclusion was that consciousness is not just computation, it is something else occurring in the physical structure of the neuron, and microtubules were his candidate for where that something else lives. Here is where the field pushes back. Hard. The brain is warm and wet. Quantum coherence, the kind of coordinated quantum behavior that Orch-OR requires, is extraordinarily fragile. It collapses almost instantly when a quantum system interacts with a thermal environment. Most quantum computing research today is done at temperatures near absolute zero, precisely because biological temperatures destroy coherence before it can do anything useful. The idea that neurons, operating at 37 degrees Celsius, surrounded by constantly moving ions and water molecules and thermal noise, maintain the kind of quantum coherence Orch-OR needs, is considered implausible by most physicists and neuroscientists who have examined it. That objection is not trivial. It is the central reason the mainstream field has N. Ott followed Penrose and Hameroff. Is the objection decisive? Not obviously. Some research has found evidence of quantum effects in biological systems once thought too warm and noisy to support them. Photosynthesis appears to use quantum coherence to transfer energy with startling efficiency. Certain bird species seem to navigate using quantum effects in their visual systems. Biology has found ways to exploit quantum mechanics in environments where physicists assumed it was impossible. None of that validates Orch-OR directly, but it weakens the automatic dismissal. Set aside Orch-OR specifically. The broader point Penrose is gesturing at is harder to dismiss. Quantum mechanics itself contains a problem that has never been satisfactorily resolved. When a quantum system is not being observed, it exists in a superposition of possible states, described by a wave function. When it is measured, the wave function collapses to a single definite outcome. What collapses it? The standard formulation of quantum mechanics says, observation, measurement, the act of a system interacting with something that registers the outcome. This is not a fringe interpretation, it is the standard textbook account. And it is deeply strange, because it places observation, measurement, something that sounds like experience, at the center of how physical reality resolves itself in potential into actual. Why does nature require an observer? What counts as an observer? These questions have been debated since quantum mechanics was formalized in the 1920s. They have not been settled. And notice what the question implies. If the most precisely confirmed physical theory in history cannot be fully formulated without invoking the concept of observation, And if we cannot explain what observation is without explaining consciousness, we have a circle. Physics needs consciousness to make its predictions complete, and consciousness needs physics to explain how it exists. Neither field can close its own loop without the other. That is not a proof of anything. It is not evidence that Orch-OR is correct, or that consciousness is quantum, or that Penrose's reading of Gödel is right. What it is a structural indicator. The most rigorous account of physical reality we have built seems, in its foundations, to point back at the thing it cannot explain. When the most precise physical theory ever developed seems to require an observer to make nature's outcomes real, and we cannot explain what an observer is without explaining consciousness, that circularity is not a coincidence worth ignoring. Here is the thing about the hard problem that never quite lands when it is discussed in the abstract. You are the hard problem, not a version of it, not an example of it. The thing itself. Right now, as you process these words, as the meaning assembles itself somewhere behind your eyes, there is something it is like to be you doing that. That felt quality, immediate, private, undeniable, is precisely what 30 years of formal scientific literature cannot account for. And here is what makes that strange. It is the one thing you are most certain of. Descartes built an entire philosophical framework on this point. You can doubt almost anything. You can doubt your memories. You can doubt whether the external world exists as you perceive it. You can doubt whether your sensory experience accurately represents anything real. But you cannot doubt that you are having an experience right now, because the act of doubting is itself an experience. The cogito, I think, therefore I am, is not a clever argument. It is a self-validating observation. Doubt it and you confirm it. It is the only proposition in philosophy that works that way. So here is the situation. The thing you are most certain of, your immediate subjective experience, is the thing that the most credentialed researchers in neuroscience and philosophy of mind cannot explain. Not because they lack data. We have more data on the brain than at any point in human history. We can image neural activity in real time. We can map which circuits activate during attention, during memory formation, during language processing. We know a remarkable amount about how the brain handles information. What we cannot explain is why any of this handling feels like something. Think about what is actually happening right now. Sound waves are reaching your ears and being converted into electrochemical signals. Or light is entering your eyes and being transduced into neural impulses traveling toward your visual cortex. Your brain is parsing syntax, building semantic representations, integrating meaning across sentences. Every one of these steps is mechanical. Every one of them can be described in purely physical terms, as the movement of charged particles through biological tissue, as changes in membrane potential, as the release of neurotransmitters across synaptic gaps. This is computation, sophisticated computation, but computation. And yet, there is something it is like to be you, doing this, right now. There is a quality to the experience. The sound of a voice has a particular character. The sense of understanding a sentence carries its own felt texture. That quality is the thing that should not exist if the physical description is the complete description. Nothing in the physical account, not the electrochemical signals, not the firing rates, not the information integration, reaches across and explains the felt character of what you are experiencing. The explanation stops at the mechanism. The experience continues past it. Here is where the implication splits in two directions. Either the physical universe somehow produces consciousness despite having no mechanism that anyone has identified for doing so, meaning consciousness emerges from matter through a process we do not understand and cannot currently conceive of understanding, or the physical universe is not the kind of thing we think it is, not purely physical at its foundation, not built from fundamentally inert, non-experiential components that somehow, at sufficient complexity, generate inner life. Possibly built from or grounded in something that already has, at the most basic level, some relationship to experience. Neither of those options is comfortable. Both are serious. The first asks you to believe in a kind of emergence that has no precedent and no proposed mechanism. The second asks you to revise your most basic assumptions about what matter is. What does that tell you about the position science is actually in? It tells you the problem is not at the edges. It is at the center. What you are, at the level of subjective experience, is not explained by what we know about neurons. The correlations are real. Damage the right region of the cortex, and specific features of your experience disappear or change. The brain and consciousness are connected, deeply and systematically. But correlation is not explanation. Knowing that certain neural activity accompanies certain experiences does not tell you why those neural processes feel like anything. The fingerprint is there. The explanation for what left it is not. And notice what that means for the question this entire discussion has been building toward. We are not in a situation where the answer exists and we are waiting to find it. We are in a situation where our current conceptual framework may not be capable of producing the answer. That is a different problem, a bigger one. Treating it as settled, assuming confident physicalism, assuming that consciousness will eventually reduce to neural mechanism just as liquidity reduced to molecular interaction, is not a scientific position. It is an assumption about what the answer will look like before the answer has been found, and assuming the opposite, that consciousness is therefore supernatural, or mystical, or beyond any possible systematic understanding, is the same error from the other direction. And the honest answer, the one that the evidence actually supports, is that we do not know what you are, not at the level that matters. Here is the honest state of the evidence, not the comfortable version, not the version that sounds like a conclusion. Consciousness exists. That is not a claim that requires defense. It is the one fact you cannot argue your way out of, because the act of arguing confirms it. Every objection you raise, every doubt you form, every alternative you consider, all of that is conscious experience happening. You cannot step outside your own awareness to check whether awareness is real. It is the ground everything else stands on. Here is what else we know. Damage the visual cortex in specific ways, and specific aspects of visual experience disappear. Damage the hippocampus, and the ability to form new memories collapses. Sever the corpus callosum, and the two hemispheres begin behaving like separate conscious systems. The brain and consciousness are correlated, tightly, consistently, measurably. That is not in dispute. What we do not know is whether that correlation is identity, whether consciousness is what certain brain processes are, or whether it is something else. A consistent relationship between two genuinely different kinds of thing. 30 years of neuroscience have produced more data on this than any previous era. The correlation is better mapped than ever. The explanation remains exactly where it was. We know that consciousness involves information integration. We know it involves global broadcasting across distributed neural networks. We know it involves complexity, binding, attention. IIT gives you mathematics. Global workspace theory gives you architecture. Quantum approaches give you a different level of physical description. Each of these is serious work. Each of these explains part of what the brain does when a person is conscious. None of them, and here is my position on this, stated plainly, none of them explain why any of that processing is accompanied by felt experience rather than happening in the dark. The hard problem is not a gap in a footnote. It is a gap at the center. And every theory we have either stops at the edge of that gap or pretends to cross it without showing. You, the bridge. What does that tell you about the institutions? The hard problem was formally named in 1995. Integrated Information Theory was published with full mathematical rigor in 2004. A letter signed by leading consciousness researchers in 2023 acknowledged openly that after decades of direct competition between the two dominant theories, neither had been validated. The field published a formal acknowledgement of its own impasse, and the response from the broader scientific community was essentially what it always is: coverage, discussion, and then the same structural incentives pulling funding toward tractable questions and away from the one question that actually matters. That pattern is not neutral. That is a signal. Not knowing the answer is not the same as the answer not mattering. That distinction is worth holding on to. The hard problem is not an abstract puzzle for specialists. It is a puzzle about what kind of thing reality is, about what you are, about why the universe contains anything from the inside, rather than only from the outside. Those are not philosophical hobbies. They are the questions underneath every other question. Whether consciousness is physical, whether it is fundamental, whether it requires a new framework entirely. The answer to any one of those changes what we think we are doing when we do science, when we form beliefs, when we make choices. The stakes are not small. The silence around those stakes is the most interesting data point in this entire story. Here is where we actually stand. We know consciousness exists. We know it correlates with specific physical structures and processes. We know it involves integration, complexity, and global information access across the brain. We know that none of those correlates explain why any of it feels like anything. We know that every serious theory dissolves part of the mystery and leaves the center untouched. We know the institutions best positioned to pursue this are structurally oriented away from it. That is the complete list, not a preliminary finding, not a temporary gap before the next breakthrough. That is the actual state of the evidence, and it has been the state of the evidence for 30 years. The universe contains beings for whom existing feels like something. And we do not know why. And that is the most important thing we do not know.